It starts with a single click, quiet, unremarkable, almost accidental. An employee at one of the most trusted names in digital security drags an email out of their junk folder and opens an attached spreadsheet labeled 2011 Recruitment Plan. Nothing crashes. No skull and crossbones blinks to life. The cursor just hovers. The window looks ordinary. And somewhere deep in the machine, an embedded exploit ignites. In that instant, attackers slip past the perimeter of RSA, the company whose secured tokens underpin access to defense contractors, Fortune 500 enterprises, and government networks around the world. The irony stings. To compromise the keys to the kingdom, the adversary didn't go through the vault door. They walked in through a side corridor that looked harmless. We are in the war room, present tense. Phones are face down. Monitors glow with packet captures. The words "advanced persistent threat" are more than a buzz phrase. They're the readout of a live engagement. Analysts see command and control beacons that shouldn't be there, privileged sessions that don't make sense, and archives being prepared on a staging server in the dead of night. The question shifts from, are we breached? To what exactly did they take? Because at RSA, what sits behind those walls are not just files and invoices, but secret seeds, the cryptographic lifeblood of two-factor authentication for a substantial slice of the modern economy. Before this incident, SecureID functions like an unspoken contract. Press the button on your token, read the 6 digits, pair them with your PIN, and gain access. It's mundane and immensely powerful. A heartbeat of rotating codes that says, you are who you say you are. When that system is shaken, it feels like gravity is uncertain. Could the codes be predicted? Could adversaries forge the second factor? And if the answer is maybe, then how many doors, in how many places, just became easier to push open? This is the RSA data breach surgic, an intrusion that forced the industry to confront the limits of its safeguards, the resilience of its culture, and the uncomfortable truth that no control is beyond being weakened if the humans and processes around it can be bent. In this episode, we will reconstruct how the breach unfolded, what was actually taken, why it mattered, and how the shock waves rippled to some of the most sensitive corners of national defense and enterprise computing. We'll move quickly at first, the first hours, the crucial missteps, the first signs of lateral movement, and then we'll slow down into a cool forensic register, analyzing the root cause, the blast radius, and the long-term impact on identity, trust, and the business of cyber defense. To understand the stakes, you have to understand what RSA means to authentication in the early 2010s. RSA Security Division of EMC at the time is synonymous with SecureID, a two-factor authentication system composed of a personal identification number and a time-based one-time password generated by a token. Millions of users carry these tokens, little fobs with numeric displays, or run software equivalents on their phones or laptops. Inside each token is a secret seed, a cryptographic starting value that, when combined with a clock and an algorithm, produces a stream of 6-digit codes. Servers on the other end run by enterprises, defense contractors. Banks hold a matching copy of that seed for each specific token. If the server's calculation matches the user's code, plus the right PIN and account, access is granted. Why does that matter? Because by 2011, password-only systems are already recognized as brittle. Phishing kits and keyloggers are abundant, password reuse is rampant, and attackers can test billions of guesses at negligible cost. Adding a second factor changes the economics of attack. Even if a password is stolen, the attacker needs a fresh 6-digit code that changes every 30 or 60 seconds. The code depends on a secret seed the adversary should never possess, and the server expects those numbers in a specific sequence synchronized to time. It's elegant, battle-tested, and crucially, widely adopted in sectors where compromise is catastrophic. RSA simply sell hardware. It sells trust. The company's brand is a promise that the relationship between a specific token and the server that validates it is unforgivable without the seed. This is why the seed is sacred. It's treated like a crown jewel in manufacturing and provisioning, guarded in back-end systems, and associated with token serial numbers and customer deployments. If an adversary could obtain the seed to serial mappings for specific customers, they could, in theory, simulate the ephemeral code displayed on a device without physically possessing it. They would still need the user's static PIN or password, but the second factor, the hard part, would be weakened. Now put that trust in historical context. The late 2000s and early 2010s mark a rise in what the industry calls advanced persistent threats, or APTs. These are not vandals. These are patient, resourced adversaries who study the defenders, collect intelligence, and stitch together multi-stage operations that unfold over days or weeks. Social engineering is a hallmark. Zero-day exploits vulnerabilities unknown to software. Vendors are prized because they bypass antivirus and intrusion prevention. Lateral movement is purposeful. The aim is not to smash and grab, to reach the systems where the valuable data lives. In that environment, a company like RSA is both a supplier and a symbol. Its clients include some of the most security-conscious organizations on Earth. If you were an adversary looking to gain leverage across a swath of high-value networks, you might not attack each customer head-on. You might instead look for a way to weaken the common mechanism they trust, perhaps not to fully break it, but to tip the scales in your favor when you do launch targeted intrusions downstream. That is the strategic logic that makes RSA an attractive target for a sophisticated campaign. The attackers don't need to make SecureID universally worthless. They need enough of the right data to make specific future attacks more likely to succeed. This background also explains why the later public statements from RSA were so careful. The company stressed that customer data wasn't stolen in the conventional sense of names and account numbers, and that SecureID remained a strong system. Both statements could be true while still allowing that information related to SecureID seed records, serial associations, internal procedures, and deployment data had been exfiltrated in a way that degraded security for targeted customers. In security, nuance matters. But in the heat of an incident, nuance is also what panics people, because it forces them to mentally map possibility spaces where the worst-case scenarios feel newly plausible. Early March 2011. 2 waves of spear-phishing emails land in the inboxes of small groups of RSA employees, not top executives, not high-profile engineers, people whose names would attract little external attention. The subject line is the ordinary language of corporate planning. 2011 recruitment plan. The message is short and unobtrusive. The Excel attachment appears legitimate enough. To some recipients, it even lands in the junk folder. But curiosity or routine diligence wins. Someone retrieves it and opens it. Time 0. What happens next is invisible to the naked eye. Embedded inside the spreadsheet is a flash object that exploits a then unknown vulnerability. When the document is opened, code executes, a backdoor is installed, and the machine becomes a beachhead. The attacker now has an agent inside RSA's network, beaconing out to a command and control server on the internet. The first hours are reconnaissance. The adversary wants to understand the directory, the permissions, the naming conventions, the lay of the digital land. They try credentials, they sniff around file shares, they test which accounts and services can be leveraged. Within days, the attackers achieve privilege escalation. A compromised user leads to a compromised system, which leads to another user with elevated rights. This is the chess of network intrusion. Collect a credential here, pivot to a server there, dump a hash somewhere else, and step your way up the ladder to domain administration. The attackers take care to blend in. They work at off hours. They schedule jobs that look like maintenance. They route their control traffic through intermediaries. They move slowly enough to avoid tripping alarms trained to notice spikes and surges. At some point in the first week, the adversary touches systems tied to SecureID. These are not public-facing endpoints. They are internal repositories of manufacturing and provisioning data, and systems that manage the links between token serial numbers, seed records, and customer deployments. The attackers prepare archives. They compress files. They organize them into chunks. They stage the data on servers inside RSA first, then move it out through encrypted channels to external hosts they control. The exfiltration is not a single burst. It's systematic, segmented, and timed to look like normal outbound activity. Mid-March 2011. RS detects suspicious activity. Whether it's an anomaly in log files, an alert from a security product, or the sharp eyes of an analyst seeing patterns that don't fit, the company realizes it is not dealing with malware noise. This is a determined intruder inside sensitive systems. Containment procedures begin. Segments are isolated. Credentials are rotated. Systems are pulled offline for forensic imaging. The incident response tempo accelerates, and so does the need to communicate. The firm grapples with what to say to customers and regulators, because while the internal picture clarifies, the external implications are enormous. March 17, 2011. RSA goes public with a carefully worded notice. The company has been the victim of a sophisticated attack, and certain information related to SecureID products has been extracted. The phrase "advanced persistent threat" is used explicitly, signaling both the caliber of the adversary and the scope of the operation. RSA explains that the stolen information could potentially be used to reduce the effectiveness of SecureID in a targeted attack, but does not concede that SecureID is broken. Customers are urged to harden their deployments, watch for anomalous login patterns, add monitors for remote access, consider risk scoring, and be prepared to add compensating controls. The weeks that follow are a tense balancing act. On the one hand, RSA must complete containment and eradication. On the other, it needs to re-establish customer confidence. The company begins to work with major clients, especially those in defense and critical infrastructure, to assess risk and plan mitigations, including replacing tokens and reissuing seeds where appropriate. Communication is ongoing but guarded. Too much detail could help the adversary. Too little detail feeds rumors. Meanwhile, security teams across industry parse the implications. If attackers have obtained seed-to-serial mappings for specific customers, then targeted campaigns against those customers could pair stolen or phished passwords with forged one-time codes calculated offline. Late May 2011. A major U.S. defense contractor detects a sophisticated intrusion attempt that appears to involve valid usernames and plausible one-time codes. The contractor responds decisively, resetting credentials, suspending remote access where needed, and escalating to government partners. The public disclosure reinforces what many suspected. The RSA breach is not an isolated embarrassment. It is a force multiplier for follow-on attacks against high-value targets. Within days, RSA acknowledges that information stolen from its systems has been used to try to attack customers and announces measures to replace tokens for affected organizations and further strengthen the ecosystem. Summer 2011. RS commits to a large-scale replacement effort. Tokens are reissued, seeds are regenerated, and back-end processes are examined for weaknesses. Customers receive guidance on tightening policies, shortening token code lifetimes where possible, rotating PINs, limiting remote access, and adding additional checks for logins from new locations and devices. The replacement effort carries a substantial financial cost, but the strategic cost is about trust. Enterprises must decide whether to stay with SecureID, switch to alternative multi-factor systems, or add more layers, smart cards, certificates, Device posture checks to reduce reliance on any single factor. The immediate incident winds down, but the narrative doesn't. Security conferences buzz with hallway conversations about seed management, supply chain threat models, and the fragility of assurance when core identity providers are targeted. For years after, the RSA breach is a reference point in tabletop exercises and procurement meetings, not because SecureID failed as a technology, but because a targeted campaign demonstrated how even robust controls can be weakened if an adversary gets upstream of your trust anchor. At the center of the intrusion is a familiar playbook executed with discipline. The initial access vector is spear phishing, not scattershot but tailored. The attackers craft an email designed to be plausible inside RSS culture. A spreadsheet about recruitment plans is innocuous in a global company. It reads like planning, not panic. The absolute key is the embedded exploit. The Excel file contains a flash object that executes code when rendered by the victim system, leveraging a vulnerability that at the time is a zero-day unknown to the vendor, unpatched, and undetected by standard antivirus. 0 days are valuable because they bypass the first line of automated defenses. When a staff removes the email from junk to inbox and opens it, the payload runs without requiring macros to be enabled or the user to grant obvious permissions. The payload installs a remote access tool, a backdoor, that gives the attacker command line control, file system access, and process manipulation. Tools like this often hide as ordinary services, register themselves for persistence, and call out to command servers at regular intervals. The call-out is the lifeline. From the defender's perspective, it looks like an outbound connection to a web host or a series of short-lived sessions to addresses that don't immediately trigger threat intelligence hits. The adversary's infrastructure is typically layered. Traffic might bounce through compromised servers or rented hosts in multiple countries, obfuscating origin. Once the beachhead is established, the attacker begins internal reconnaissance. They enumerate the local machine. What user am I? What groups am I in? What shares can I see? They query the domain controller for a list of users and groups if they can. They seek password hashes, cached credentials, or tokens left behind by administrators who logged into the compromised machine. These artifacts can sometimes be harvested and replayed. If they are lucky or patient, they find a path to privilege escalation, perhaps a local privilege escalation exploit to become system on the host, followed by credentials that enable lateral movement. Lateral movement is the art and science of stepping closer to the target. Attackers may use Windows administrative protocols like RDP, SMB, or WMI to move from one machine to another, especially servers. They look for servers that store source code, configuration data, or production secrets. In RS's case, systems related to secured provisioning and manufacturing become prime objectives. These systems might not be outwardly labeled crown jewels, but their file structures, database names, and access patterns give them away. The attackers test the waters open, a directory here, copy a small file there, and verify that their actions do not provoke alarms. When they're ready, they stage data. Staging is an important operational step. Rather than exfiltrating directly from multiple sensitive servers to the outside world a highly suspicious pattern, they collect data internally first. They compress archives, sometimes with password protection, and move these bundles to an intermediate server inside the network that has more permissive egress rules. This also lets them test transfer sizes and timing. Exfiltration then proceeds from the staging server to external hosts using encrypted protocols. Because the data is now in larger chunks, fewer connections are needed, each carefully timed to blend with normal traffic. What kind of data matters? In the context of SecureID, the most valuable targets are seed records and their mappings to token serial numbers and customer assignments. A seed by itself is just a cryptographic value. But when paired with the serial number of a token deployed to a specific user at a specific company, it becomes a key to reproduce that token's code stream. Still, reproducing codes is not the same as logging in. Most secure deployments require a static pane plus the time-based code. So the attacker must also obtain the user's PIN or password. This is where the breach became a force multiplier rather than a silver bullet. The adversaries could combine the stolen secured data with targeted phishing for PINs, keylogging on user endpoints, credential theft from VPN concentrators, or password reuse elsewhere to assemble the pieces needed to impersonate a user in real time. Defenders sometimes ask why two-factor codes can't simply be guessed. The answer is math and timing. A 6-digit code has 1 million possibilities. If codes rotate every 60 seconds, and the server allows at most a handful of attempts per window, brute forcing is unrealistic. But if an attacker can calculate the correct code for a given token at the current minute, because they possess the seed in time, they need only one try. In that scenario, the deterrent is not the unpredictability of the code. It is the remaining factor, the PIN or password, and any contextual checks the server performs, like geolocation, device posture, or risk scoring. This is why RSA, in the immediate aftermath, urged customers to add monitoring around remote access and to consider increasing scrutiny for logins from new locations or devices. Another critical technical layer is threat actor tradecraft. The adversary used tools that were common in targeted intrusions of that era, including remote administration kits that provide keylogging, screen capture, and credential theft modules. Their lateral movement likely relied on living off the land techniques using native Windows tools to avoid dropping suspicious binaries. Their exfiltration routes were chosen to look like normal user behavior, avoiding ports and protocols that would stand out. And they took care to clean up, deleting tools and artifacts, clearing logs where possible, and covering tracks. From the detection standpoint, the breach is a case study in the limits of perimeter-centric thinking. Email filtering stopped some messages, remember. The first wave landed in junk, but not all. Antivirus didn't recognize the payload because it leveraged a 0-day. Once inside, the attacker's activity looked like a careful administrator going about business at odd hours. The telemetry needed to catch them came from correlation. This account shouldn't access that server at this time. This host shouldn't transfer this volume of compressed data to that external IP. These credentials shouldn't appear in sequence across these machines. Behavioral detection and lateral movement analytics techniques that are now mainstream were, at the time, less mature. The last technical layer is incident response at scale. RSS had to identify all touched systems, determine what was viewed versus what was taken, rotate credentials, and validate that the adversary was truly out. They had to rebuild trust in their own seed management processes, verifying that seed generation had not been tampered with, that manufacturing systems hadn't been altered to introduce weaknesses, and that the mapping between seeds and customers could be regenerated from known good data. For customers, the technical work was equally daunting. Replacing tokens means coordinating logistics, updating server-side records, re-enrolling users, and in some cases, temporarily changing remote access policies to maintain operations while the swap is underway. The most immediate impact of the RSA breach was not a cascade of instant compromises, but an abrupt change in the risk posture of any organization that relied on SecureID for remote access. In corporate terms, the breach transformed a control with high assurance into a control with conditional assurance until proven otherwise. Boards and CISOs asked, do we carry an elevated risk of impersonation? Which of our tokens might be predictable if an adversary has seed mappings? How do we know whether our users' PINs are safe? Overnight, multi-factor authentication went from a box-checking measure to a subject of urgent, nuanced debate. For defense contractors and critical infrastructure providers, the anxiety was sharper. Many of these organizations were already targets of persistent, well-resourced adversaries. The knowledge that those adversaries could have obtained data capable of reducing the effectiveness of a widely deployed second factor meant that remote access policies had to be revised immediately. Some companies suspended remote logins or required additional verification steps. Others accelerated the adoption of smart cards, client certificates, or device posture checks layered on top of SecureID. The message was not that SecureID had failed universally, but that the calculus of a high-end adversary's chance of success had shifted. At RSA itself, the fallout was financial and reputational. The decision to replace tokens at scale for heavily targeted customers carried a substantial cost, measured in tens of millions of dollars in the near term, and potentially more over time in service credits, operational disruption, and lost deals. But the deeper cost was about credibility. RS is a brand built on trust and cryptographic stewardship. While the core algorithms of SecureID remain sound, the idea that information related to SecureID had been stolen was hard to message in a world conditioned to binary headlines. Breached or not? Safe or not? The reality-targeted weakening of assurance for some customers did not fit neatly on a slide. The breach also set off ripples across the vendor ecosystem. Identity providers and MFA vendors took note. You are not just a service. You are a supply chain node whose compromise can empower adversaries upstream of your customers. That understanding accelerated investments in seed protection, hardware security modules, manufacturing isolation, and zero-trust designs that assume the vendor's own perimeter can be pierced. Auditors and regulators started asking different questions during reviews. How do you generate and store seeds? Who can access them? What logs prove that no tampering occurred? What is your plan for mass reissuance? The bar moved. For customers, the fallout included operational pain. Replacing tokens is not like pushing a software update. It's logistics and change management. Users need new devices or software reprovisioning. Help desks field spikes in calls. Applications need to recognize new token IDs. Remote workers need guidance. A control that normally just works suddenly becomes a project with dependencies in HR, IT, and security. That cost is rarely captured on a balance sheet, but it is real. It also drove some organizations to diversify their authentication stack, adding a second MFA vendor or adopting standards-based approaches that reduced reliance on any one proprietary mechanism. Public perception and media narratives amplified the stakes. Reports that a major defense contractor had detected an intrusion following the RSA incident hardened the fear that seeds had been weaponized in the wild. Even though those contractors were not catastrophically breached and, notably, detected and contained attempts, the story crystallized in the public mind that this was not an academic risk. This psychological shift matters. Security programs live and die by the willingness of organizations to spend on resilience before disaster. The RSA breach provided a tangible story that justified budget for phishing-resistant authentication, anomaly detection, and vendor risk scrutiny. Perhaps the most important fallout, though, was cultural. Inside security teams, the incident became a parable about humility. If a security company can be phished, anyone can be phished. If a core trust anchor can be targeted upstream, any link in the chain can be targeted. This realization fueled the move toward assuming compromise building architectures that operate on the premise that an attacker will, at some point, gain a foothold. It also recalibrated training priorities. The image of an innocuous spreadsheet ending up in a junk folder, retrieved by a well-meaning employee, and opening the door to a nation-state adversary, is a more effective training story than 1,000 posters. There were legal and policy dimensions as well. Breach notification practices for companies whose products underpin other organizations' security controls were scrutinized. The precision and timing of disclosures became talking points in industry forums. Government agencies weighed how to coordinate with vendors whose compromises present national security implications. The breach thus sits at a hinge moment, the period when cybersecurity moved from a specialist concern to a board-level and policy-level issue with real-world implications for how nations and corporations manage shared risk. The RSA breach forecast the era we now inhabit, where identity is both the front line and the fault line. As more applications and infrastructure moved to the cloud, the second factor became the last bastion. Adversaries adapted. The modern successors to the tactics glimpsed in 2011 are phishing kits that proxy real-time FA prompts, SIM swap operations that intercept SMS codes, and malware that steals session tokens after successful logins. The lesson isn't that multi-factor is futile. It's that the design of multi-factor must evolve toward phishing resistance and cryptographic binding tied to devices and origins that adversaries cannot trivially emulate. In practical terms, this means a shift towards standards like FIDO2 and WebAuthn, where the private key never leaves the user's device and authentication is bound to the domain, eliminating the class of attacks that hinge on replaying codes. It means expanded use of device-bound credentials, secure enclaves, and hardware-backed attestations that survive server-side seed theft. It also means increased adoption of risk-based access controls that continuously evaluate context during a session, not just at login. If a user's token produces the correct code, but the login originates from a machine with no health attestation, from a geography inconsistent with historical behavior, at an hour that breaks the pattern, the system should challenge, restrict, or deny. On the vendor side, the breach accelerated the maturation of zero-trust doctrine, never trust, always verify, assume breach. For identity providers, this translates into stronger internal segmentation, auditable seed generation processes, widespread use of hardware security modules, strict access controls with just-in-time elevation, and aggressive egress monitoring from the systems that store the most sensitive data. It also implies a renewed focus on third-party risk inside the vendor, the contractors, the service accounts, and the admin tools that often serve as the soft tissue around the core. The human layer remains pivotal. Social engineering is not a nuisance. It is the first domino. Organizations that treat phishing training as a checkbox will continue to be the soft targets that open the door for high-end adversaries. The future points toward training that mirrors the sophistication of actual campaigns' limited run. Carefully crafted simulations that test not just whether users click, but whether the organization's layered controls catch malicious attachments post-click. In that world, someone clicking is not the end of the world if the endpoint is hardened. The exploit is mitigated, lateral movement is contained, and anomalous data staging causes an alarm. From a policy perspective, the RSA breach nudged the conversation toward shared accountability. Identity vendors, customers, and regulators have interlocking responsibilities when the trust fabric is threatened. The future likely holds more explicit guidance on how core security suppliers report and respond to compromises that could affect downstream users, including standardized frameworks for risk communication that move beyond ambiguous phrases toward concrete actions customers should take. It also suggests a larger role for government in coordinating responses when vendor compromises implicate critical infrastructure or defense networks. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the breach reminds us that security is never a product. It is a process. Some organizations learned the wrong lesson in 2011, declaring two-factor broken and retreating to the false comfort of passwords. The right lesson is subtler. Controls can be weakened by hitting them from unexpected angles. To stay ahead, we need architectural patterns that are resilient even when individual components are compromised. Compromise one factor and the system leans on another. Compromise a seed, and the hardware-bound key stands firm. Compromise a user's password, and the contextual risk model slams the door. The future is layered, adaptive, and relentlessly audited. The RSA data breach is a story about one email, one click, and a chain of carefully executed steps that, taken together, threaten the bedrock of how organizations authenticated their most privileged users. It is also the story of how quickly a community can respond by detecting downstream attacks, by replacing tokens at scale, by rethinking assumptions about seed protection and vendor risk, and by investing in the next generation of authentication that doesn't ask humans to be perfect to keep systems safe. The drama is not in cinematic explosions, but in the quiet power of meticulous adversaries and meticulous defenders engaged in a contest of patience and craft. If you're listening from a SOC, a boardroom, or a cubicle where you occasionally fish things out of the junk folder, take this with you. Controls do not fail or succeed in isolation. They live inside ecosystems of humans, processes, and vendors. The email you don't click is a victory. The endpoint that doesn't silently execute an exploit is a victory. The lateral movement that trips a behavioral alert is a victory. The downstream customer that detects and contains an attempt enabled by an upstream breach is a victory. Security is a mosaic of such moments, and the RSA incident shows both how they can align for the attacker and how they can align for the defender when we build layers that do not assume perfection. So what's the call to action? Treat identity as your strategic perimeter and invest accordingly. Assume breach and architect for containment. Ask hard questions of your vendors, especially those who hold your trust anchors. Move toward phishing-resistant multi-factor that cannot be replayed or simulated by virtue of a stolen seed. Instrument your environment to notice not just the bad signatures, but the bad stories, patterns of behavior that don't fit. And teach the story of RSA, not to scare, but to normalize vigilance as an organizational habit. In the end, the value of revisiting this breach is not to relive a headline. It's to harvest wisdom from it. The attackers who compromised RSA were patient, creative, and pragmatic. Our response needs to be the same: patient in building culture, creative in engineering, and pragmatic in accepting that nothing we build is invulnerable. If we keep those truths in focus, then the next time an innocuous-looking spreadsheet drifts into a mailbox where it doesn't belong, the story will end before it begins.